Welcome to our Peace Dividend interview series, inviting some of the nation's most respected thought leaders to offer an objective look at U.S. foreign policy. Today, we are honored to have the distinguished world-acclaimed scholar, historian, and peace advocate, Peter Kuznick, currently professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. His acclaim and popularity are certainly deserved. In addition to his contributions in academic circles, he is in constant demand as a policy analyst and commentator across the globe. He is author of Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America, and many other important volumes. Peter is best known by the general public for his highly controversial landmark documentary created with director Oliver Stone, The Untold History of the United States, which has been distributed and viewed worldwide, receiving enthusiastic reception and generating much needed debate. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for being here with us.
My pleasure, John.
Today's interview focuses on 5 questions. World events continue to unfold at a quickening pace. Facing an alarming escalation in tensions around the world, we look to Professor Kuznick for his most current thoughts. We're focusing on the realities of international power struggle unfolding in real time, tensions, and specifically addressing the role of the U.S. in these tensions and its capacity to reduce them. We hope to discover paradigm shift ideas for improving the prospects for peace. Shall we go? Ready to go?
Yes.
First question. We hear a lot of terms and acronyms bandied about: deep state, MIC, fire sector, ruling elite, oligarchy, neocons. Who actually defines and sets America's geopolitical priorities and determines our foreign policy? Not officially and not constitutionally, but de facto.
Well, I think that all of the above that you mentioned have been up to their elbows and deeper in setting U.S. policy over the years. I mean, people like to point to the military influence, and clearly the military has had a lot of influence, but we're really dealing within a capitalist structure. And when Oliver and I did our Untold History of the United States, which we framed as a history of the American empire and the national security state, we began our survey back in the 1890s. And you see the foreign policy elite evolving over those years. And it's a combination of economic, military, and policy analysts, or statesmen, in quotes, statesmen. And the original expansion of the American empire was largely in response to the depression of the 1890s. And that was a depression caused by overproduction. The US by the 1890s was the world's leading manufacturing country already. And so they had a couple of choices. The issue was, what do we do with this surplus? And there were 2 basic choices. One was to raise standard of living in the United States so that American workers could consume the surplus, elevate their standard of living, raise pay, do all the things that progressives might like to see. The other was to search for overseas markets. And once you search for overseas markets and cheap labor and investments, then you're going to be dealing with the problems of empire. The 1900 election was between William Jennings Bryan, who was a Democrat and a populist, and McKinley, who was an imperialist. And Bryan's whole point was that if you allow empire, then you've got to have militaries, and you've got to have bureaucracy, and you've got to be willing to kill on a large scale around the world. We can talk about the earlier expansion across the continent and the notion of manifest destiny in 1823, and the founding of the country in slavery and genocide against Native Americans. But by the late 19th century, there's a bit of a paradigm shift. But the American approach to domination was very different than the European approach. The Europeans had formal colonies. And by the late 1890s, the Germans were already trying to catch up, and they expanded a lot in Africa. But you had the Belgians, and you had the Dutch, and the British, and the French, and they controlled much of the planet. But the United States had a different approach. Since we were a colonial nation, that we had emerged in certain ways through liberation struggles, the Americans tended to look down upon that notion of colonialism. So the Americans had what they called at the time, Secretary John Hay in 1899 issued his open door notes. And what that meant was that the United States was going to shun the idea of being a colonial empire. We were going to become an open door empire, which meant we demanded equal access to the markets and the labor forces and the resources around the world without creating the big colonial structures that the Europeans had, that the Brits had in India, and the French in Indochina, and everybody in Africa. So we had a different kind of empire. And while we intervened repeatedly, especially in Central and South America, between 1900, 1898, and the 1920s, and or until Roosevelt's good neighbor policy in the 30s, and we get involved in various wars, we don't follow the lead of the Europeans. And that gives us a lot more flexibility and allows us to gain access where other countries were competing and not gaining access. So when the Boxer Rebellion in China, and they try to stop the Europeans from colonizing and exploiting, the United States gets involved and sends troops there, but we don't create the same kind of empire. Part of the reason we didn't like what the Japanese were doing in China in the 1930s was because they were closing the door to American trade and investments. We didn't like that. One of the reasons we didn't like the Germans, as opposed to other Europeans, was the Germans were much more restrictive on American economic investment and gain. So the United States wanted the fruits of empire without all the costs of empire, and has largely been able to attain that. But you have this group of policymakers who have this vision of American hegemony. And this goes back, you could argue, to Winthrop's sermon aboard the Arbella in 1630 in Massachusetts Bay, when he says, "We shall be as a city upon the hill. The eyes of the world will be upon us. We will be the moral force and the leaders of the world." That gains a certain kind of sophistication after World War I. When Wilson goes over to Versailles and he says, "Now the world will see America as the savior of the world." Those are Woodrow Wilson's words, not the 14 points, not progressive international democracy, but the US is a savior of the world. I mean, that's a vision that we've seen repeated over and over again. We've seen it recently with Madeleine Albright, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton. When Madeleine Albright says that we're the indispensable nation, she says, if we use force, it's because we're America. We're the indispensable nation. We see farther and stand taller than other countries. And that justification, so even when the United States, does terrible things around the world, we say our motives and our intentions were good, but our policies were mistaken. Vietnam, when Robert McNamara came into my class some years ago, he told my students he accepts that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war. That man is often considered the architect of the Vietnam War or the invasion of Vietnam. And he says 3.8 million. And so, we look at who was behind that policy. In the Eisenhower, Kennedy, especially the Johnson administrations, it was people like McNamara, people like Rusk, people like Bundy. These are not horrible people. In many ways, McNamara was racked with guilt for what he did, but they have this vision that the United States is the leader of the world, and we've got to exert that, or else there's chaos and autocracy, or other dictatorships, communist dictatorships, and they're atheistic. So, but you also have, as you well know better than anybody, the people who profit from this. And and those are the military companies, the defense contractors, the weapons makers. In mid 1930s, Gerald Nye from Nebraska held hearings in the Senate around the war profiteering in World War I. And World War I became a very unpopular war very quickly. And the people who were profiting off it, the Mellons, the DuPonts, some of the other arms manufacturers, were called merchants of death. You look at the post-World War I movies, The Big Parade, All Quiet on the Western Front, Wings, some of the most popular movies of the 1920s and early 1930s were powerful anti-war movies. The literature, the kind of literature that was being written by Dos Passos and Faulkner and so many of the others was strongly anti-war. And so they had these hearings in the mid-30s, and the idea was as soon as the United States goes to war again, that they're going to either nationalize the defense sector or they're going to tax 99% of the profits. I mean, so these are ways, because they understood the deep immorality of profiting off killing. You know, and the same thing now, every time one of these drones is shot off in Ukraine or elsewhere, that's money in people's pockets. The obscenity of people encouraging and profiting off death and destruction is horrifying. It's mind-boggling. It's nauseating. And so that's another big part of the group that's involved in this. And then there's the military themselves, who've got an interest in war. Yeah, we know some people who are in the military become anti-war. My friend Larry Wilkerson, Smedley Butler, most decorated Marine in America, wrote that great book in 1940, War is a Racket. And he talked about, he starts off as an 18-year-old in China, and there was Spanish-American War, and in China, and then this country and that country, and Nicaragua and Haiti, and everywhere around the globe. You know, and he says, I was a high-priced, errand boy for Wall Street. So you've got the capitalists, you've got the corporation, you got the defense manufacturers, you've got the policymakers, you got the military. That's a pretty big grouping. But if you look at it more narrowly, in the Reagan administration, many of the people who were in the Reagan administration were members of the Center for, what are they called? The CPD. Under Carter, they came from the Trilateral Commission. Then in the 1990s, you've got the rise of the neocons, and they've formed the Project for a New American Century. And almost all the top positions, the Committee on the Present Danger, back at the CPD under Reagan, then they formed the Project for a New American Century in 1997. And after Bush steals the 2000 election in a coup, really, then they take over all the top policymaking positions in the Bush administration, and they give us Afghanistan, and they give us Iraq, and that horrible world that George W. Bush creates. And then in the Biden administration, you look at that. The Biden administration, 18 top policymaking officials come from the Center for a New American Security. So you've got people who actually map out, plot the ways to maintain American domination, American hegemony. So you've got this straight line of militarists who are in bed with the military planners and who are in bed with the corporations and the defense manufacturers. And they've brought us a world in which it's so difficult. Militarism is so pervasive in the United States, it almost goes unseen and unrecognized. But if you're somebody like me who watches too much baseball and too much football, you can't go to a sporting event in the United States without flyovers by warplanes, and all of this patriotic hoopla and symbolism and heroes of the game with the military. I mean, it's really nauseating how militaristic the U.S. is now, and in some ways has been for a long time. So I think it's a combination of all of them. When it comes to domestic policy, there's a big difference between the Democrats and Republicans. When it comes to foreign policy, there's hardly ever been a difference. They're both parties are warmongers. And Biden, so he surrounds himself with 18 members of the Center for New American Security, but then he picks Anthony Blinken, who was not with the Center for New American Security, but he supported the invasion of Afghanistan, supported the invasion of Iraq, supported the invasion of Libya, supported the bombing in Syria. So they're all from that same mold. And, that's what we're up against, dealing with these militarists who think there's a military solution to the world's problems. And there isn't in almost all cases. And we get deeper and deeper in this to now with the situation in Ukraine is really in many ways terrifying. We are really on the brink of nuclear war, as we can talk about.
And on that optimistic note, the next question. We've had decades of international tensions. Recent developments have seen a sharp escalation in the potential for a major war, as you just said. The U.S. apparently cannot be at peace. Threats against the homeland are allegedly increasing in number and severity. The trajectory of our relations with the rest of the world appears to be more confrontations, more enemies, more crises, more wars. Is the world, in your opinion, really that full of aggressors, bad actors, and ruthless opponents? Or is there something in our own policies, which actually you mostly answered this, something in our own policies and attitudes toward other countries, which puts us at odds with them, thus making war inevitable and peace impossible?
Let me give you an example, John. I just finished, before I got on with you, an interview on Russian TV about the situation in Iran. Now, for most Americans, Iran is a bad actor. They support terrorist groups, Hezbollah, Hamas. They are giving drones now and missiles to Russia that are being used to kill people in Ukraine. And they do a lot of things that a lot of us might not like. The theocracy there is cracking down on women who are protesting for their rights, for human rights in Iran. It is in many ways a repressive theocracy. But what Americans don't understand is, because they have so little historical context, is why the Iranians hate the United States. And unless you've got a sense of history and go back at least to 1953, in 1953, the leader in Iran was Mohammad Mossadegh. He was the leader, the inspirational figure throughout the Arab world. He was the first Iranian to get a Doctor of Laws degree from a Western university. Mm-hmm. He was Time Magazine Man of the Year on the cover the previous year. The U.S. ambassador said he had the support of close to 98% of the Iranian people. What did he do that made him such a bad guy? He supported nationalizing Iranian oil. The Iranians were getting almost nothing from their oil. And the Iranian oil was run really by British oil interests. And so they nationalized, the Iranians nationalized the oil industry in Iran so that the Iranians would get the benefit of their oil and not the British. Now, the British were not in a very strong position to challenge that, given the fact that they just nationalized a lot of industries in England right before that. But that didn't stop them. And they tried to plan a coup. They didn't quite pull it off. When Eisenhower gets elected and brings Dulles in as Secretary of State in 1953, the Americans moved quickly to reverse Truman's hesitant policy before that. And so in 1953, the CIA runs a naked, blatant coup, overthrows Mossadegh, who was enormously popular and progressive, and replaces him with the Shah, who was reactionary, repressive, militaristic, but a friend of the United States. And then the Shah is in power till 79, when Khomeini leads this Iranian uprising and overthrows the Shah and puts in this anti-American regime. So the Americans do what? So we support Iraq in its war with Iran. A million people are killed there. And I mean, the United States has a history there. There are good reasons why the Iranians hate the United States. It's as if the Soviet Union had intervened in the United States in the 1960s, assassinated John Kennedy, and replaced him with some pro-Soviet tool there. And of course we would hate the Soviets for having done that. We hated them already for other reasons. But that's the world we've created, a world in which the United States has consistently supported backward, reactionary, militaristic, exploited regimes that are willing to play ball with American interests. Not everywhere. Sometimes we've been on the right side of things, but too often the United States has been on the wrong side of what's going on. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, one of the top Soviet officials said, "We're going to do the worst possible thing to you, Americans. We're going to leave you without an enemy." And this was a year period. You talk about the peace dividend, as you know. This is when Clinton promised the peace dividend, and Bush before him, and then Clinton. We were going to have a peace dividend. Well, you know as better than anybody, it hasn't happened yet. We needed enemies, and the Russians did not provide us a good enemy in the 1990s. But Iraq provided us a good enemy. And so when the Project for a New American Century forms, from the very beginning, we could take it back further. Okay, 1990. So the Soviets are collapsing. The Berlin Wall comes down. Charles Krauthammer, leading neoconservative thinker, writes an article saying that this is America's unipolar moment. Nobody can challenge us in any region of the world, even in that region. Says the US is the most dominant force the world has ever seen. And that for the next 30 to 40 years, the US is going to maintain that position of domination over the rest of the world. In 1992, the leading neoconservative thinkers come up with the defense planning guidance, which they lay this out. When it's leaked to the public, then they have to retract it. And even Biden and others denounced it at the time as a Pax Americana. But in 1997, they formed the Project for a New American Century. And the first thing they say is we've got to finish what George H.W. Bush started in Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein. They also, in 2000, put out a report saying it's going to be hard to rebuild America's defenses because we've let down our guard in the 1990s. We didn't have a real enemy. They said we can't do this quickly unless there's a new Pearl Harbor. Well, they're lucky. In 2001, 9/11, they got their new Pearl Harbor, and they immediately jumped into action. And so, but then you look at that, and by 2003, so first in 2002, you've got Krauthammer revisiting what he said in 1990 and said, I made a mistake. I underestimated the strength of the American empire. He said, this was not America's unipolar moment. This is the unipolar era. The United States is going to dominate the world indefinitely. And then in 2003, even before we invaded Iraq, you see that on January 5th, 2003, the New York Times front page magazine section, big headlines, American empire, get used to it. All the neocons came out of the woodwork. But before that, they had denied the idea that we possibly could be an empire. Now they're bragging about it. We invade Iraq. We overthrow Hussein and kill him. But we don't govern there. We don't protect the people. We don't protect the antiquities. All we do first is control the energy ministry and the treasury, and it turns into a nightmare. And Iraq becomes a magnet for global jihadis. By 2005, the head of the Arab League, Musa, says all hell is broken loose in Iraq. And by 2006, even Krauthammer acknowledges, well, he was wrong, that the moment of apogee of empire has passed and that the unipolar era is over and we're going to struggle to maintain any kind of hegemony. But they have this military solution. And so in 2000, and from the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or in 1990, it was not just Bush and Baker who promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch, 1 thumbs to the east. It was also the German leaders, Hans-Dietrich Genscher and the others. It was also the French leaders. It was the British leaders. You go to the National Security Archives and you look up NATO expansion, and they got a dozen different leaders or more who promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand. Well, that was not worth the words that it was mouthed. He didn't get it in writing. That was Gorbachev's huge mistake. But NATO was holding meetings within that same year to plan for the expansion. They didn't even give it a year before they were planning it. They waited till the late 1990s before they actually began the expansion. So it begins with Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia. And then in the early 2000s, it expands much further. And now with Finland and Sweden, what is it, 16 countries up to Russia's doorstep? And so, but this planning is going on behind the scenes. So America needed enemies. And we needed, what do they say about Saddam Hussein? The Condoleezza Rice and George W. Bush and Cheney. We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. We've got to take him out before he exercises weapons of mass destruction. There's always this threat about weapons of mass destruction that's going to justify us invading other countries. Not so much in Afghanistan. There, the excuse was that the Taliban was welcoming the Al-Qaeda leaders. The U.S. CIA station chief in Pakistan said that we gave the Taliban an ultimatum, said either you give us the Al-Qaeda leaders or we're going to invade. Well, according to the CIA station chief in Pakistan, said that the Taliban was desperately trying to give us the Al-Qaeda leaders. We had many, many meetings with them about this. And he said if the US had just given a little bit to let them save face, then they would have given it. But the United States wanted a war in 2002. And we got our war. We wanted a war in 2003. I mean, that they've been pushing for 5 years, if not longer. I used to make a joke, and they, part of the concern, I used to say that this was George W. Bush's dealing with his family's sexual inadequacies. He said the problem with George H.W. Bush when he didn't go to Baghdad is that he suffered from premature evacuation. And now George W. Bush is going to try to make up for that family embarrassment. But they wanted to invade Iraq. They wanted to invade Libya, even though these things always go terribly. Afghanistan were tried down there for 20 years. Iraq, who gained the influence in Iraq? Iran does, not the United States. Libya is a disaster. I mean, there are not military solutions to these problems, and we don't learn that lesson. So, so American policymakers have had their heads up their butts for a long time, and they get recycled. And so under the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton's in there. America is the indispensable nation. How great the world has been. We haven't had a nuclear war. And so what did she call for? November 2011, Foreign Policy magazine, she writes the big article titled America's Pacific Century, saying the 21st century is going to be America's Pacific century, and we're going to pivot to Asia. Campbell and Sullivan, current national security advisor, were her two principal advisors during that time, both with the Center for New American Security. And they were the ones who designed the Asia pivot. as a way to start the new Cold War against China, to contain China. It took a while to get off the ground, even though, I mean, Trump was as belligerent to China as he could be when he wasn't saying how much he loved them. But and then Biden, we hoped that when Biden got into power, he was going to reverse Trump's policies. But once again, Biden doubled down on Trump's policies toward China. But the Chinese are no longer in a position where they're supplicants to the United States. So when Blinken and Sullivan met with the two Chinese top foreign policy officials in Anchorage in March of 2021, the Chinese laid down, read them the Riot Act, laid down the law to them and said, you can't talk to China from that position of superiority anymore. Said, look at all the things you've done. Look at, you think that we're a problem in the world. You're the problem in the world. And they didn't pull their punches. It later gets referred to as wolf warrior diplomacy, but the Chinese were just in a different position. And I mean, there's a lot of things that China does that I don't like, but standing up to the United States was certainly something that was long overdue. And so this attitude that the Americans have that they can dictate to everybody and throw their weight around, it no longer reflects the current reality.
So there are bad actors, but we make them worse, or we portray them worse than they are in order to create enemies for ourselves?
I guess I would say there are no good guys in the world.
Except for you and I.
Except for us, yeah. But but you and I don't run governments and don't run countries.
I know.
I haven't checked on yours lately, but I know my military is not very strong. So, as Stalin once said about the Pope, well, how many divisions does he have?
Right.
So between us, we don't have any. But when I look at the leaders, I see Biden wants to make America great again. Putin wants to make Russia great again. Modi wants to make India great again. Xi Jinping wants to make China great again. Liz Truss wants another day in office. Boris Johnson wants to make Britain great again. I mean, all these leaders are most parochial, narrow-minded nationalists, and nobody speaks for the planet. Nobody speaks for humanity broadly conceived. They all have these myopic views of the world. And you look at it, we've got 9 nuclear powers in the world. Every single one is modernizing its nuclear arsenal. Every single one is making its nuclear arsenal more efficient, more lethal. And that's what they're trying to do. Britain is planning to increase its nuclear arsenal by 40%. The Chinese apparently by more than 300%. The United States is spending $2 trillion to modernize its nuclear arsenal and also to make them more usable. When Trump was first briefed about nuclear weapons, he said, what's the point of having them if we can't use them? And so a solution, like a sane person would say, okay, let's get rid of them, like Gorbachev said in 1985, 86, 87, until he died. But to Trump, that means let's make them more usable. So he proposed mini nukes, these tactical nuclear weapons that are much lower yield, that'll be more usable. Putin has them too. The Russians have a 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons over the US. They have maybe 2,000. We've got about 200 or so. And so, unfortunately, the world is run by madmen. Mostly are men, almost overall, and very, very dangerous, and who are willing to play nuclear chicken with the future of the planet. Right now, Biden and Putin have veto power over the continued existence of life on this planet. But Xi Jinping is trying to get there too. And by the end of the decade, the US intelligence is saying they'll have 1,000 nuclear weapons from the under 300 that they had at the start of this year. So, I mean, I think as a species, we're hanging on by a thread.
I mean, so the next question you've pretty much answered, but maybe you'll want to elaborate on it a little bit. Our leaders relentlessly talk about our national interests and our national security, warning that both are under constant assault. Yet we spend more than the next 9 countries combined on our military. Why does such colossal spending never seem to be enough?
Well, because we used to spend more than the rest of the world combined. And now we only spend more than the next 9 countries combined.
We're slipping.
We're slipping. And they look at it that way, John. These people are insane. They look at it that way. And they see that the Chinese have developed capabilities, especially in their region. You know, if we don't go to war over Ukraine, I hope, the next one in line is go to war over Taiwan.
Mm.
Well, the Chinese have been building up their capabilities in that region. And the Pentagon has run 18 war games of war between the US and China over Taiwan, and China has won all 18 war games. So if you're a military strategist, you say, well, how do we get around that? How do we circumvent that? How do we build up our forces? There was just an article in the New York Times saying that the US is trying to build up Taiwan's weapons capability so that Taiwan could hold off China for at least the first 2 weeks. They believe that China will blockade Taiwan if fighting starts. China decides it has to take Taiwan militarily, and it would take the US at least 2 weeks to get there. So they want the Taiwanese to be able to hold out in terms of energy supplies, in terms of food supplies, in terms of weaponry, for at least the first 2 weeks. And so they're going to they're talking about building up the Chinese stockpile of weapons. And they're learning from Ukraine which are the weapons that can do that most effectively. So in terms of the question of why the United States needs to do this and why other countries think in the same way, when the United States invaded Iraq, the North Korean government said Saddam Hussein made one big mistake, and that was not having nuclear weapons. If the Iraqis had nuclear weapons, the United States could never have invaded. And they're right. The same thing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Had Khrushchev not blundered strategically, and had he announced to the world that those missiles were there, that the nuclear warheads were there, and that there were 100 battlefield nuclear weapons, the United States could not have contemplated an invasion of Cuba in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis would have been averted. But as we know, that was the closest we've come to nuclear annihilation before now. So nations want to have a preponderance of power over their adversaries. And in the nuclear world, you can't do that. Even with missile defense, even with preemptive strikes, even with submarine launched ballistic missiles. And you just, the likelihood, if we went to war in 2006, there was an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, the Council for Foreign Relations, one that people in the United States don't seem to know anything about. An article by Lieber and Press, 2 nuclear strategists, that said the United States has finally achieved first strike capability against Russia and China. That if the United States launches a first strike against Russia and China, neither side would be able to strike back. That we finally achieved the wet dream of America's nuclear strategists, this kind of preponderance where they could not strike. That even the Washington Post, the other newspapers who covered it, said that the heads were exploding inside the Kremlin. It's Foreign Affairs magazine, the CFR magazine, they took that as official US policy, and they prepared for a US first strike, just as they had back in the 60s. And we don't have John Kennedy. I mean, one of the points I make in all my interviews about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the biggest difference is that we had Kennedy and Khrushchev in power then. Khrushchev said when he was first briefed on nuclear weapons, he couldn't sleep for days. Khrushchev hated nuclear weapons. He said to Norman Cousins after the crisis ended, he said, peace is the most important thing in the world. If we don't have peace, and the nuclear weapons start to fall, what difference will it make if we're communists or Catholics or capitalists or socialists, or Jews or Christians? He said, who will be left to tell us apart? Once those bombs drop, there'll be nobody left to tell us apart. Kennedy made the same comment when during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the meetings of the top advisors, when he meets with the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and LeMay says, "Oh well, Kennedy says, what will happen if we do invade Cuba and take out the missile sites?" And LeMay says, "They won't do anything." Kennedy says, "They won't do anything." Says they have to respond. They'll at least respond in Berlin. And LeMay says, "No, they won't. They won't do anything." And then Kennedy leaves the office, he leaves the meeting, and he says to Kenny O'Donnell, his advisor, he says, "Those brass hats have one big advantage. If we do what they say, there'll be nobody left alive to tell them they were wrong." Kennedy knew that. Khrushchev knew that. And they both looked for a way out. The sad thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that Kennedy projected this image that the reason why the Russians backed down and removed their missiles is because we were strong and we were adamant and we threatened them, and they backed down because of our show of superior strength. When the reality was, the reason why the crisis ended without a war was because they negotiated this backroom deal that doesn't become public for 27 years. It was diplomacy. It was not the threats. And afterwards, Kennedy said, "I cut Khrushchev's balls off." And in the Kremlin, they were saying Khrushchev shit his pants. So and the world's image was that it was this kind of strength and toughness, when the reality was it was soft power, it was diplomacy, it was peace negotiations, it was backroom deals. And the same thing has to happen in Ukraine. So the United States is supplying them with massive amounts of weapons. And Biden said, "I'm not going to put any pressure on Zelensky to negotiate. It's up to them." The reality is the United States is putting all the pressure on Zelensky to negotiate, just like the Chinese and the Indians and the Iranians should be putting as much pressure as possible on Putin to negotiate. And they should figure out, do we go back to Minsk 2? Do we go back to February 24th? Where is this the end point? But it is too dangerous in the nuclear age. Kennedy said at his American University commencement address in June of 1963, the most brilliant presidential address of the 20th century, he says, in the nuclear age, you can never put another nuclear power in the position where they face either humiliation, a humiliating defeat, or nuclear war. He said to do so would be madness. He said be either a sign of the failure of our policy or the sign of a collective death wish to do that. It's exactly what we're trying to do. It's when Lloyd Austin and others keep saying our goal is to weaken Russia, to defeat Russia, to humiliate Russia. And to do that means putting Putin in that corner where he has to choose between humiliating defeat or using his nuclear weapons. And I don't want to risk the future of humanity on the idea that Putin is going to back down. I mean, it's not in his makeup.
And probably not in the greater interests of the Russian people. So it's evident that you and many individuals who follow you and support your work believe that America's direction in both the diplomatic sphere and in the current conflict zones represents exercise of government power gone awry. Can you paint for us, this is a big question, can you paint for us in broad strokes the specific changes in our national priorities and policies you view as necessary for the US to peacefully coexist with other nations, at the same time keeping us safe from malicious attacks on our security and rightful place in the world community?
Well, the main attacks that we face two major existential threats right now. One of them is being exacerbated and worsened by the war in Ukraine and by our military policies. And that's the environmental threat. That's global warming. This is if we continue the way we're going, much of the world will be uninhabitable. Much of India and China will be turned into a desert and will be uninhabitable well before the end of the century. During my granddaughter's lifetime, many of the ocean nations are going to be flooded, engulfed underwater. The coasts, even in Florida now, you got those idiots running that state. Large parts of Miami and other areas are underwater much of the day now, and that's only getting worse. So what? And you think of it. You know what happened when the 1 million or 2 million refugees from the Middle East and Northern Africa flooded into Europe? The response was fascist governments, and that was 1 or 2 million people. And all the uproar, the anti-immigrant feeling across Europe. Now you've got right-wing governments in Sweden and in Italy, of all places, fascistic governments. Imagine what it's going to be like when there are 100 million climate refugees later this century. If 1 or 2 million can do this, what is the world going to be looking like when there are 100 million desperate people fleeing their countries because of the climate crisis, because of the droughts, because of the heat, the soaring heat? These countries are going to be uninhabitable. And, so that's a terrifying prospect. Do we deal with that? Our security policies say this is a real threat, but they think of it in terms of losing some of our bases that are going to get flooded, not in terms of the broader consequences for mankind. And the second thing we have to deal with, even before the first one or simultaneously, is we've got to deal with the nuclear crisis. As long as nuclear weapons exist, and I'm afraid that one of the lessons that's going to come of this current crisis is that the big mistake Ukraine made was giving up their nuclear weapons after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had the Budapest Manifesto and the Russians promised to safeguard Ukrainian security. And how much was that worth, that promise? Not very much. And so countries are going to draw the lesson that North Korea has drawn. You look at North Korea's nuclear doctrines. They've recently revised them. Before, they were only to be used in retaliation for a decapitation strike against North Korea. Now they can use preemptively against anybody who threatens North Korea with an invasion or a strike or decapitation. So we're going the wrong direction as a planet. And that's my concern. My concern is now with Iran, for example. The Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which was developed in 2015, was a great deal and was working. And Trump, the idiot that he was, pulls the United States out in 2018. And now, as a result, at that point, Iran gave up 97% of its enriched uranium. It mothballed its centrifuges. It was not allowed to increase the enrichment beyond 3.67%. Now it's increased the number of centrifuges, increased the amounts of enriched uranium, has enriched uranium up to 60%, has enough uranium to build at least one, and pretty soon two, nuclear weapons, and can easily increase the enrichment from 60% to 90%. That shows the wisdom of these leaders. And Biden promised during the campaign he's going to get the US back into that deal. Well, he didn't do it. The Biden administration is frighteningly militaristic. I don't know what Biden's own instincts are, but certainly he's not made the world any safer. They're making the world much, much more dangerous than it needs to be or should be. So the things that immediately get me are the two existential threats, the wars that we're waging And the proxy wars that we're waging, this fighting in Ukraine is a full-fledged proxy war between NATO and Russia right now. And China and India and some of the others. Well, it's interesting that about 60% of the world's population lives in countries that have not gone along with the US NATO sanctions or US EU sanctions. So, and that's partly because they know the US hypocrisy. They say, you're right that this is terrible what Putin is doing in Ukraine. But who the fuck are you to talk after you invade what you did to Vietnam and what you did to Iraq, what you did to Afghanistan, what you did to Libya? The world sees it that way. The US militarism, US bases. China's got what, one base around the world and some military installations in the South China Sea. The US has 800 bases around the world. I mean, the US has a strategy of this kind of total domination and containment of Russia, containment of China. And so the world sees that. They see the hypocrisy. And they see China, on the other hand. I don't think the world likes what China is doing to the Uyghurs in those detention camps. I don't think the world likes what China's doing in the South China Sea. I don't like what's going on in these places. They don't want Xi Jinping to have another 5 years or a lifetime term, and the kind of militarism and repression that's going on, and the lack of freedom there. But they like China's Belt and Road policy to a large extent, and they like a program for global development that can raise people's standards of living. We need that. We need worldwide health systems that, we used to be able to say that there were two advanced industrial countries that didn't have a national health system that covered all of its population. And that used to be South Africa and the United States. Well, South Africa does have one now. So the only country that doesn't, advanced industrial country, is the United States. I talk to my students about the history of the welfare state, and that the French women got paid maternity leave back in 1913. And I ask them, when did the United States get paid maternity leave? And of course they laugh, because it doesn't have paid maternity leave or health care for everybody. And, we just have a pathetic, our values are upside down. And so I want to see us deal with the base question, the pandemic question, the climate change question, the nuclear question, the wars question, and I want to see us, as you say, dismantle the military-industrial complex and use that money for the peace dividend that we promised 3 decades ago and we still haven't delivered on. The priorities have got to be people and improving people's lives. We're all on this planet for a very short period of time, especially in the scope of all of history. We're here for a brief moment, and there's no reason why we shouldn't have more freedom, more democracy, higher standards of living, more creative, enjoyable, peaceful, harmonious, community-based lifestyles. That's the vision that we have for how human beings should live and could live.
So this brings us to the final question, and it's really probably the most important question, especially in light of what you just said. You summarized the things that we really need to address, drastic 180-degree turns that we need to make in our approach to things. The general public, especially when it's aware of the self-sabotaging results of our current foreign policies and military posturing, clearly wants less war and militarism, preferring more peaceful alternatives on the world stage and greater concentration on solving problems at home. As peace activists, we are thus more in line with the majority of citizens on issues of war and peace than those currently in power. So here's the question: what happens if we determine that those shaping current US policy don't care what the citizenry think, or simply not listening to us? What if we conclude that our Congress, for example, is completely deaf to the voice of the people? What do we do? What are our options then? What are our next concrete steps as political activists in working toward a peaceful future?
Well, John, again, this is a topic that you've given as much thought to as anybody, and and it's the hardest question of all. Um, I mean, my approach always, I'm sort of out of the mainstream of the peace movement in that I do 250 interviews a year with media all over the world and a lot of talks all over the world. But I'm not a movement person like I used to be when I was younger. And I find my strength personally is to think and express ideas and not get down and do the nitty gritty of day-to-day organizing like a lot of my friends do. And I respect the hell out of them because they do it. Um, so, my own answer was always educational and trying to reach as many people as possible. So Oliver Stone and I did the Untold History of the United States. The book, you know, the book is now more than 900 pages long, the new edition, and was the New York Times bestseller for 7 weeks initially. The documentaries aired all over the world. Almost every day, I'm hearing from people who say it changed their lives. And, but my goal always, I mean, most historians write a book or an article that gets read by, if it's an article, maybe 200 people, a book, maybe 500 people, a successful project, a few thousand. And I was lucky enough, because of my friendship with Oliver Stone, to do a project that reached scores of millions of people. And I had this fantasy that it was going to somehow really change the world. But right from the very beginning, it got sabotaged. The New York Times and the New York Review of Books wrote the most defamatory, irresponsible, dishonest hatchet pieces on it, knowing that what comes out there is going to influence a lot of what goes on in the world. And so Oliver and I had to take out full-page ad in the New York Review of Books, challenging this with blurbs from the first blurb we got on the project was from Mikhail Gorbachev. The second was from Bill Maher. The third from Dan Ellsberg. And then all the historians started to weigh in. Pulitzer Prize winning historian Martin Sherwin said this is the most important work of the 21st century. And a lot of other historians said also this was like mind-blowing in its brilliance. But we were fighting again, right from the beginning, against an establishment that hated what we were saying because we were talking about peace and we were criticizing American empire and national security state and wars and ignorance and backwardness. And so, so my efforts have been, given my own strengths and position and access, to try to reach as many people with these messages as possible. And I'm getting back on Russian television again. And I'm sending this message out to the Russian people. I was twice on Solovyev's show, this most popular show on Russian TV. And he's a real nationalist, but he wanted to have me on there to talk about the nuclear threat, which scares people everywhere. And I'm on Iranian TV. And the last thing my interview about a couple of days ago about Russia and China and what's going on in the world, he said, well, is there anything else you want to add? And I said, yeah, I want to send a shout out to the women of Iran. I said, their bravery, their example, their moral stance has inspired us all over the world. And the guy at the end says they're going to be able to use that, on Iranian TV. I don't know if they did or not, but but I think all of us have got to do everything we can to reach as many people in whatever way we can. You do it through your interviews and broadcasts. I do it my way Other people do it other ways, and all of our efforts are desperately needed because we're up against the media that I do mainstream media all over the world on a regular basis. I do almost zero mainstream media in the United States. People with my views and your views do not get on US mainstream media, right? You get on US mainstream media and you criticize, I could criticize the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I would say, but we have to put it in context and realize what the Russians are doing. We have to also criticize the US invasions of all the countries, and that the US has been the worst malefactor in recent history since the 1960s, not Russia. And that we have to understand that, not from the standpoint of American nationalism and American exceptionalism, but from the standpoint of humanity. We have to approach our answers to all the questions as global citizens, not citizens of Japan, not citizens of the United States, not citizens of Russia, but as global citizens. And because we live in an interconnected global world, if there is a nuclear war, God forbid, or anybody forbid, I don't know, but if there's a nuclear war, even a limited nuclear war, the latest findings by the experts, the scientists, are that a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, would send 10 million tons of smoke, soot, and debris into the upper atmosphere, circle the stratosphere within 2 weeks, block the sun's rays from hitting the Earth. Temperatures on the surface of the Earth would plummet to freezing. Much of the agriculture would be destroyed. A limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan using 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons would lead to the deaths of up to 2 billion people. Well, we don't have 100 nuclear weapons. We've got more than 13,000. And then the size of the Hiroshima bomb, most of them are between 7 and 70 times as powerful. So even a limited nuclear or a large-scale nuclear war could end life on the planet, or pretty much all of it. And that's the reality we have to deal with. And so we have to, but then the question is, you don't want to just scare people, because we know that that doesn't always work. They're scared enough as it is. They're scared in the United States of crime. They're scared of immigrants. They're scared of woke culture. They're scared of gay children and transvestites. They're scared of everything, these people. So we want to also appeal, like you do, to the positive side of what could be done with these resources, with this talent that's going to waste now in perfecting the means of killing rather than giving people better lives. But I also do believe in joining and forming organizations. David Vine is at it again. And David Vine is creating this big US organization to dismantle the military industrial complex. And there's going to be a meeting in November to strategize. And the leaders of many of the peace groups and anti-nuclear groups, the idea behind it is we should all be working together rather than these separate groups that are balkanized, that each going after its own constituency on its own issue. We have the common interest in dismantling the military industrial complex and moving toward peace and the peace dividend and life. George Wald, the brilliant Harvard biologist, made a speech in 1969 that I once wrote about, in which he says, we scientists, we opt for life. And that's a choice that we as a civilization, a global civilization, have. Are we going to opt for life, or are we going to opt for death? And, and we say most people agree with us, and that's true. And most Russians do. But I see the polls saying that 70% of Ukrainians want to keep fighting, despite the horrors of what they're experiencing in Ukraine, want to keep fighting until they drive Russia out of every inch of Ukrainian territory. If I were Ukrainian, maybe I would think that way, but I'm not. And from the standpoint of being a citizen of the world, I don't think we can risk that, because so many threats You've got Kadyrov, who is the Chechen leader and a close ally of Putin's, saying that Russia needs to use its tactical nuclear weapons now. You've got Podolyak, a leading advisor to Zelensky, who says if Russia even thinks about using its nuclear weapons, we need to have a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia. But you've got leaders on all sides who are talking seriously about the use of nuclear weapons there. And once that happens, as even Biden said correctly, he said, even the use of a single tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine could lead to Armageddon. And that's a lesson that Kennedy and Khrushchev learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. They both knew that they had lost control. They both knew, and Khrushchev writes a remarkable letter to Kennedy when the crisis ends. And he said, from evil, some good must come. Our people have both felt the burning flames of thermonuclear war. We've got to get rid of all weapons that could cause us again. He said, we've got to eliminate every conflict between us that could cause another crisis. We've got to settle them all. And then they began, Kennedy and Khrushchev, that last year of Kennedy's life, began working toward that. And so in Kennedy's AU commencement address, he says we have to end the Cold War. We have to end the nuclear arms race. You know, he says we have to end the space race. We need peace. And Kennedy got that at the end because he comes into office as a hardline Cold Warrior and a hawk. But he learned. The problem is very few leaders learn in office. And clearly, Biden has not yet shown the capability of learning. Maybe it's his age, maybe it's his temperament. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's his worldview. But we can't leave it up to these people. So we have to mobilize. We have to spend as much time, put in as much effort, do everything we can to reach as many people and say there is an alternative and that they've got to mobilize and that this is not some abstract concept. This is all of our collective lives and our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives and future generations' lives. We might not be able to create the utopia on earth that we would like to see in the next 100 years or the next 1,000 years. But what we've got to do is make sure that we have a future and a world that we can hand on to future generations so that someday we might not live to see it, and I'm afraid we won't, but future generations can.
So we're running against a time limit, and I want to thank you. This has been a wonderful interview. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thought-provoking insights. You're obviously very passionate and committed, and we really appreciate that. And thank anyone out there who's also watching this. I want to make one last reminder, good folks, though it's almost entirely absent from the national conversation, peace is not a four-letter word. Never give up hope and keep on fighting. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, John. It's been fun.